Good afternoon to our friends in Europe, and good morning to everyone joining from the United States. I'm Alina Polyakova. I am the president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, coming to you from Washington, D.C. CEPA is a US-based think tank devoted to promoting close and enduring ties between the United States and Europe. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you tuning in via Zoom or following along on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube to this discussion on Central European priorities in a post-COVID environment, co-hosted by our friends at the GLOBSEC Policy Institute, coming to us from Bratislava. So a special thank you to Elena Kuczko, who will be leading today's discussion. But before I pass it over to Elena, I want to note that many Central Eastern European countries have fared better against COVID than their Western counterparts. And now that the initial shock of the virus is beginning to abate and countries are starting to reopen their economies, leaders are turning their attention to the long-term implications of COVID for economies and national security. How countries keep their economies afloat in the wake of COVID-19 is going to be a generational challenge. Today's discussion will focus on how Central Eastern European countries' priorities have shifted in response to the COVID crisis, especially now that they have begun the process of reopening. This conversation is part of CEPA's broader body of work on Central and Eastern Europe, in particular looking at the common challenges we face. And now that common challenge is, of course, the COVID-19 crisis. We have been lucky at CEPA to have the opportunity to host previous conversations with the Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic, Minister Tomáš Petříček, and also the Foreign Minister of Poland, Jacek Czaputowicz, regarding both countries' response to the pandemic. For those of you tuning in on Zoom, there will be time for questions that you can pose later in the discussion. And for those of you tuning in on Twitter, Facebook, and elsewhere, please use the hashtag Common Crisis and tweet questions to @CEPA or @GLOBSEC. And now, before further ado, let me open formally and welcome our distinguished speakers, Aleš Chmelar, who is the Deputy Minister for European Issues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the Czech Republic, Martin Klus, the State Secretary for European Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs of Slovakia, and Konrad Szymanski, who is the Minister of European Affairs of Poland. I'm sure this will be a lively and informative conversation. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. And with that, let me turn it over to my wonderful co-host, Elena Kuczko, Director of the GLOBSEC Policy Institute, who'll be moderating today's conversation. Elena, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alina, for the introduction. Good afternoon and good morning to all our participants joining from various time zones, and greetings from Bratislava. Ministers, GLOBSEC is very delighted to have you with us, many of you again. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be with us today. This event is part of our GLOBSEC effort to help find and facilitate the best ways for Europe to overcome the current health, economic, and political crisis. We're very pleased to have this event in partnership with our great colleagues from the Center for European Policy Analysis. We will aim to make this discussion conversational, so I will jump straight into the first question. There have been contrasting assessments of the European responses to the COVID-19 crisis, including the joint European response, both in terms of health measures, but also in terms of tackling economic, political, and social challenges associated with it. What do you think? Is the European Union and individual member states, are they on the right track in overcoming the multiple crises we're all facing? And maybe you can also lead us a little bit about the highlights of how your national policies and priorities at the European level have changed as an outcome of the crisis. Minister Chmelar, I would start with you.
Okay, thank you very much, and also thank you for inviting me to this very interesting and timely debate. And congratulations to GLOBSEC also to gathering actually so many good speakers actually in this week and in general on this very important topic. On your questions, rather briefly, because it would require quite a larger analysis and many data is not available yet. What has to be said above all is that everybody was taken by surprise, that Central and Eastern Europe might have been a little bit more prepared, because we've seen the consequences not just in China, but already in Italy, and in our case also in Austria. So we had time to prepare and also to judge our steps that we do. But in terms of the impact on the EU, it was to some extent asymmetrical, and it creates maybe some questions on the very handling of the crisis by the EU. What has to be underlined, nevertheless, is that the EU did not have any tangible competence in terms of crisis management, and it had coordination role, of course. But since the crisis was so unprecedented, and since every single member state did come back to itself a little bit and looking inside itself and to its normal crisis management mechanisms, we were not able to reap the fruits of the common EU policy the first weeks. What will be crucial, nevertheless, is how we take the next weeks and months in terms of also the negotiation of the recovery instruments and of the common economic response. Because up to now, even though the economic impact has been huge, and we can expect further impact, then the impact has not yet become structural. Now, if restaurants open, if businesses start to run, and if industry is renewed, we could expect it in terms of months, even the global economy, and for sure the European economy could come back actually to its sort of equilibrium of the before crisis. So the changes might not be structural for the time being, but we are really moving very fast into a moment where some of the changes will not be reversible. We will see some structural changes certainly in value chains, which will have a big impact also on the position of Central and Eastern Europe, because we are a manufacturing power and superpowers inside the EU. As V4 countries, we represent also a bigger import partner for Germany than many larger economies, be it, of course, China, but also some other EU member states and big EU member states. And we will see how exactly we will have the structural impact. What my last point on the overall impact and what we have seen until now is that the crisis, the COVID crisis, has come in a moment where we've seen many other crises on the table, not just on the EU table. There were global issues, there were trade questions, multilateral order was put into question on several occasions. It concerned also the crisis, for example, in terms of the WHO reaction and others, but also inside the EU, we had a lot of unresolved or semi-resolved issues, be it not just the Eurozone one, which we might come to terms maybe even as part of this response to the COVID crisis. But there was, of course, the migration issue that was still not closed since 2015. There were also issues on the deepening of the single market and the finalization of the digital market. We did not have a complete plan for the Green Deal and for the transition to the carbon-free economy. So there were so many questions opened, and I hope that because the crisis came, which came with COVID, was so complex, and so critical, it could be maybe a wake-up call for many of us actually that we need to handle the crisis together, and maybe for the future also to create competencies for the EU to be able to better handle actually such a crisis in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for highlighting also the urgency of the crisis, but also its nature as a wake-up call. And passing the floor to Minister Szymański, I would also ask Mr. Minister, in your introduction, if you can also reflect to the reflection by Minister Chmielar that potentially this crisis will require some redefinition of the competencies of the European Union and potentially increasing the scope and scale of the competencies of the EU.
I think when we are talking about COVID experience in the widest possible sense, we should talk about at least two different
Mr. Minister, I think we lost you.
Epidemiological crisis in Europe. So we were all a little bit surprised and trapped in a very
Mr. Minister, I think we're losing you a little bit. If you could try to look at the connection. Apologies, everybody, for the technical difficulties here. And while we're waiting for the minister to come back, I will then go back to Minister Chmielarz and ask a little bit for a follow-up to your...
Is it fine?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I didn't know what happened. So there are two different aspects. Purely epidemiological, when the reaction of the states is a question of political decisions, the decision making, and the political stability here and political trust is very important asset. The other thing is much more complex. I would say that all economic consequences, including the consequences for the competence order in the EU, is much wider. And here, as you may remember, our reaction, reaction of Warsaw together with Rome, together with Paris, was quite skeptical. We believed since the very beginning that the European Union probably has no specific role to play in issues like public order. And rightly so, because public order, purely health issues, this sort of decisions should be made as close to the people as possible. So I don't see any added value of, for example, locking down society or locking down economies at the European level. We should be realistic. I think it is not only the question of the relevant decision on right time, right decision, but also the question of the legitimization, which is better, of course, at the regional, national level, where the state is and will be a crucial actor. But on economic aspects, European role is and should be stronger. And here we are. This is quite the right time to talk about it, because we believe that the first reaction, the financial reaction of the Union, was too limited. It's another story why I believe that the most important problem of the EU is financial limitations imposed by the frugals. Sometimes member states which would like to present themselves as the most pro-European, and at the same time they limit the abilities, the opportunities of the European Union to act, because the financial aspect of the Union is a prerequisite for the efficiency of our action at the European level. But here today we are in quite different situation, because in March it was, I think, legitimate to say that Europe should be much more active in terms of transfers, support, all instruments of recovery and resilience. Now with the European Commission's proposal, not only MFF but also European Instrument of Recovery and Resilience, Recovery Fund, to put it generally, we are in a different situation. I think the scale of the fund as proposed by the European Commission is relevant. This time it is relevant. Of course, it is not too much, having in mind that according to the European Commission's own assessment, the investment gap in the EU will be 1.5 trillion euro during the next 2 years. So the offer to have a 750 billion isn't too much, definitely, but it's relevant. I hope it will be relevant also in terms of time, because in this case, time is really money. The longer we are waiting with the injection of money to our economies, the higher the cost will be for our own economies and for our citizens, for our businesses. So we, of course, invite our colleagues to conclude this discussion as quick as possible and put this money to European economies. Of course, according to our estimation, the accumulated flow of money offered as a state aid or as a European support is still below the level of the US, which is important to remember that it is nothing excessive in this. But I think the European Commission's response for economic drama, post-COVID consequences for our economies now is relevant, and it is very important experience, because we should remember that this is the way how Union can make our life better. And this is the way how European Union can prove that it is a very important aspect in our situation. Of course, this is not only about financial transfers. I think equally important. I just wanted to mention two things. First of all, single market, which is still not finished, especially in services. This is untapped potential, very important in time of crisis. And the second aspect, state aid policies and competition policy, non-financial regulatory aspect of the Union with a huge potential, exclusive community-based competences, where if used properly, they can add enormous support for recovery and anti-crisis policies in our countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, also for putting the scale of financial aid into perspective. The IMF has released another report, and the contraction in Europe does not seem to look very well, regardless of the amounts of funds that are promised to be injected. Minister Klus, thank you very much for joining us. We've been discussing here the first reflections on the initial reactions of the European Union and the nation states to the coronavirus crisis and the sufficiencies of the reactions. What is your take? Is the European Union doing enough today?
Good afternoon to everybody. Hope you can hear me and everything goes well, also with the video. Sorry for being a bit late, and thank you for invitation to this interesting discussion. I guess we are facing huge trouble in all of our countries, as long as, for instance, for Slovakia, we have a prediction of minus 10% of GDP, not growth, but decline for this year. And that's why the only chance for us how to recover our economies are to be as strong as possible together in the European Union, because common response is the only chance how to manage it. And that's why I really appreciate to have opportunity to discuss this new generation EU way of funding and recovering our economies. And so far it seems to us that it should be a very important instrument for recovering of Slovak economy. We are aware that it will be billions of euro we need to spend in just a couple of years. And we understand that it's a very special system of financing, which could be ideologically complicated for some of us. But on the other hand, as long as we are facing symmetric shock, it's important for us to have such an opportunity. And we are heavily dependent on each other. And we understand that we need a common European response for both southern and also the other countries of the European Union, because in this case, if something will happen in Italy or Spain or Greece or some other countries, we will feel it immediately in Central Eastern Europe as well. And that's why I really appreciate that on the last GAC meeting, all of us spoke about kind of solidarity. There was quite a lot of question marks why European Union was not efficient enough at the very end of the process of pandemia. But I guess this MFF and new generation is one of the best answers we can get. And also one of the best answers for people who are somewhat hesitating in our support to the European Union integration. So that's why I'm very positive, and I'm really looking forward for the first real discussion, which will take place in Brussels, 17th and 18th of July. That will be first summit of my Prime Minister, and we are ready to be very constructive partner and try to find compromise as soon as it gets. as long as I heard from Konrad, this is very important for us, and we need a response immediately, also because of the market, but also to show unity of 27 countries and help each other as much as it gets.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. And I would want to follow up with a very quick question to all three of you, and that concerns the negotiations that are going to be held in Brussels, and if you are willing to share with us a little bit of negotiation strategy planning. There has been recently a meeting of the V4 prime ministers, but also yesterday Minister Chmielarz hosted a call with the V4 in Germany and Austria. Could you please lead us whether there is a joint V4 position towards the negotiation, whether V4 is going to act as a bloc? And if there is a position, would be very delighted to hear what are the issues that we are jointly going to be arguing in favor. Minister Chmielarz, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. I think that during the meeting of V4 Prime Ministers on the 11th of June, we've reached a common ground inside the V4, and we were quite clear on warning on two main issues. I mean, the first one is the absorption capacity for such a big instrument, and the second one is also the allocation criteria, which might still need some fine-tuning in order to be really a good response to the very crisis. But what I wanted to underline is the process that we have in front of us. I wanted to underline the fact that mutualization of common liabilities has been an issue inside the European Union, an intellectual one maybe for decades, a real policy one for the last 10 years, and I would say one that was almost unresolvable. And despite the fact that we made even treaty adjustment inside the TSCG, inside the six-pack and other instruments, we were in a way not able to go into mutualization of liabilities in the past 10 years. And now we have basically months and weeks to decide on this and to explain it to our citizens. So the process that is in front of us is not just about the negotiation. It is about the socialization. It is about explaining to the citizens what actually is happening, and that we are actually introducing inside the EU an instrument that is based on a certain insurance or reinsurance mechanism, and where there is a significant mutualization of liabilities, and creates maybe a stronger bond for the future, and even though temporary one, it transforms the EU into something more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Minister Szymański. You're muted.
By myself. No, it's fine. I think it's pretty clear that we are talking about exceptional measures for exceptional situation, for only for this reason and only for limited time, with the limited duration of the program, limited repayment scenario, very strict scenario. So I wouldn't like to define this program as a mutualization of debt or liabilities even, because the only thing we are doing now is just a higher level of EU transfers. The transfers we know very well since the very beginning, and this is why we wanted to put it in the context of MFF, of the multi-annual budget of the EU, because I agree that we are stepping on thin ice from the point of view of especially some member states, where the debt crisis was a traumatic experience, and rightly so, because it was something equally unprecedented and equally fearful for many. Now we are talking about something much more under control, let's say. So we are happy to see that the European Commission decided to create a mechanism like this. Of course, there are many things to be discussed, as Alex already mentioned. I don't want to go into details, but I think in time of crisis, in such a scale, we need a relevant answer, also in terms of money, in terms of scale. It is not only regulatory aspect, the single market and state aid policy is not enough. We need also injection of money. And we have a problem in the Union because state aid, I mean national state aid, is different in terms of scale in different member states, because of obvious things that the capacities of member states are different. So I think the European recovery instrument would help to catch the ground or establish a kind of level playing field among our economies to compensate for those who are not in a position to inject such an amount of money. So this is the right aspect of the European Commission's approach. Of course, MFF, the traditional multi-annual financial framework, is still an unresolved problem, because we believe that we have to continue our discussion about the future of treaty-based policies, namely cohesion, which is a structural or regional policy, and agriculture. We believe that they are not outdated because they proved to be open for reforms. And already now, in our countries, for example, cohesion policy plays a growing role in digitalization, climate, biodiversity, and so on. So those policies are open to reform and are ready to be a right instrument for quite present, future-oriented challenges we all have. But in the same time, we stress the importance of internal convergence at the single market level. This is beneficiary for all of us. I think that one of the most toxic aspects of this discussion is a reduction of the negotiation on budget, a reduction of the EU integration to net position in the budget. I think it is budgetary populism to say something like this, because the concept of single market and deep trade integration means that in the end we are all highly beneficiary. To be honest, countries which would like to present their negative net position in the budget, they are most successful in internal trade at the EU level. So I think we should remind themselves and remind all of us, I mean Europeans, that European budget with a very small scale, 1% of the GDP, is very important for all of us, and there are no losers in this debate. The net position in this Excel tables isn't enough to understand the beauty of the integration and the economic sense of integration. And I think during next couple of weeks, we have to remind our colleagues even stronger to present the budget in the end to our societies, especially the most frugal societies, in a way which would be not only acceptable, but attractive to them. Because without a trade integration in the common market, they wouldn't be so rich. They got enormous transfers of money from Central Europe because we are developing nicely. We are doing best. We contribute to the success of European economies. According to some statistics, without economic growth in V4 countries, the average economic growth of the EU would be negative. So we contribute a lot, and we should recognize this very fact.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Minister Klus, I'll let you wrap up this discussion on the joint V4 position, but also we'll ask a follow-up question from the discussion we had with you, but also the Czech and Austrian counterparts a couple of weeks ago, where the three of you shared the perception that in the negotiations about the next budget, there is no acting as a bloc and everybody acts in the interest of their country, hence there's not going to be a joint bloc position. Do you still share this perception, or something has changed during the negotiations in the past couple of weeks?
Well, don't you have an easier question? Okay. We four, as a bloc, actually I'm very happy that we were able to manage common LTTs during the Lednice meeting last 2 weeks ago, and I believe we were very much on the same wave if it comes to some activities we want to have together at the summit, and I'm more or less sure that there are very interesting and important changes we need to propose together. For instance, we need more trust, we need more flexibility, and we need more time. This is what we repeat all together to the European Commission, and this has something to do also with the question what the reform mean, because European Commission is proposing us to have sufficient program of reforms and to use all of these billions for something what will help our economies for a mid-term or long-term period. And I'm more or less sure that all of our countries are ready to have such a reforms. But what we need to hear also from our partner countries, especially from the south of the Europe, is the definition of the reform. And I guess this is what we have in common in V4. Also, we have in common in V4 that 2 years is not enough, as it is proposed by the Frugals 4. I can't imagine, to be very honest to you, that Slovakia will be able to manage a couple of billions of euro in 2 years only. So that's why I believe we can act as a bloc to push on the Commission and also on the Frugals countries that we need more time. I believe it's 4 years, and maybe it will be 3 years, but definitely not at 2 years. So this is what we have in common, and I can imagine that we will find a common position also if it comes to the new own resources, which is also part of the discussion, because for all of our countries, it's probably politically unacceptable that there will be somebody else to tax our citizens than our national governments. So that's why let's speak about the new own resources, but there are some red lines for us in V4, and I can imagine that all of these topics we can join as a bloc. And then of course there are some differences among us, which is natural, and also we understand, especially Czech and Hungarian position, which is not the same as the one we have in this allocation key, and also Poland is a little more successful in this. But on the other hand, kind of solidarity is inevitable. So I'm happy that my Prime Minister a couple of times mentioned that we understand our V4 neighbors, that they are not happy with the allocation key, and we are ready to support them if it comes to some, let's call them gifts or changes. But of course, our national position is quite clear that all the changes could be made only if it will not be against Slovak position, which is probably natural. So this is our position to the V4 bloc as the one which should discuss the proposal of the Commission together. But very frankly said, there are some other like-minded countries like Portugal, like Slovenia, some others we count on if it comes to the discussion. And as I said in my first block, we are ready to be very constructive partner, and we are ready for compromises, because what we need, desperately need now is to have a quick decision and start to use this money to recover our economies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. And I'm very eager to follow up on your suggestion to speak more about the new common resources. And you mentioned that there are significant red lines in each of the countries. Can I ask, please, all three of you, in a very brief yes or no, potentially type of answer, could you let us know whether, let's start with Slovakia. Slovakia will support or veto the digital tax, carbon tax, and financial transaction tax as a potential new common resource for the EU?
Very simply, we are ready to discuss all of these three new own resources for European Commission. It's inevitable to have a very clear vision what all of these taxes mean for all of us, because I can feel that there are some differences and expectations among 27 member states, but we are ready for discussion for all of these three you mentioned.
Minister Chmelash, is Czech Republic open to the discussion on these three potential new common resources?
Well, thank you for this very good question. Very briefly, traditionally, the Czech Republic has been very skeptical about new own resources. And we have voiced several times also during the discussion on the MFF itself before the crisis, our skepticism towards the new own resources. Nevertheless, the situation today has changed. It is also a temporary character that should be assigned to some of the new resources. We are implementing on the national level our digital tax, which means that in principle we would be also open for a common EU approach. On carbon tax, it really much lies the devil in the detail. If it's a cross-border carbon tax, then it's something very different, something that we could potentially accept. If it is ETS-based, then not really at this point. Then we have aspects of the FTT. I think it is a debate, maybe a 10-year-old. I'm not sure that it is on the table. And we're also quite skeptical in the past. But in general, what we have to understand on all common resources is that this is of an extraordinary nature, and that there are some common, let's say, brand new common resources offered, such as the single market levy, which could be maybe positive for Central European countries where we do not have many, maybe larger companies. But still, this is very fresh and very new for us to be able to say yes or no immediately.
Thank you very much, Minister. Minister Szymański.
We see clearly enormous opposition to offer national contributions to EU budget by some member states. It is not the case in Central Europe, but in some other member states, the opposition is very, very clear. It creates basic limitations for European project. So we propose to change the proportion between national contributions and genuine own resources. And we are absolutely not only open, but we actively promote the idea of own resources for the European Union. Of course, details are important, but the basic criteria we want to use is regressive or progressive nature of the own resources. This is why we oppose ETS-based own resources, because it would create a situation when smaller economies and poorer economies would pay more than the richest country in the EU. It is unfair, unacceptable, and I think it is pretty clear for everyone that we will not accept it. But we, in the same time, we constructively propose to work hardly, ambitious way on a single market levy, carbon adjustment border, external border mechanism, FTT, or digital tax. Yes, this is the right answer. Of course, with proportions, with details, but this is the right way to address the problem of limited financial resources of the EU. If EU is to stay relevant in our situations around us, we have to get more money, and this is the way how to do it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. And I'll start bringing up the participants with questions live. And we have the question from Kinga Brudzinska. Kinga, please unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm here now. Thank you very much, ministers, for your time and your remarks. I have a question a little bit different from the discussion that we just have had. Yesterday, the Council agreed on its position on the Conference on Future of Europe. Therefore, I would like to ask, what are your plans in your countries when it comes to this conference? What are your expectations? And maybe some tips on, and you can share with us your experience, how you plan to make it in a way that we don't just repeat this bureaucratic exercise that we had with engaging citizens in a bigger debate on future of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's start from the other end, Minister Szymański.
Thank you. We advocate for openness of the conference on the future of Europe in many senses. I think there is no risk that it will be bureaucratic, but there is a risk that it will be a conference for professional Europeanists. We are all, to some degree, professional Europeanists, but if the conference is going to offer any added value, we have to open it for the society as it is. This is why we advocate for a stronger involvement of the national parliaments, because they are definitely more representative than any other assembly. It is a democratic representation of every nation, and I think it should be promoted. Of course, we already have a quite lively contribution and role of the European Parliament, and we would like to make it open also in terms of conclusions. We don't want to have any taboo among the conclusions. So what we hear right now, that for some countries, for example, treaty change is a taboo, it is artificial. I don't believe that it is very easy to change the treaty, but we shouldn't, at the very beginning of the exercise, we shouldn't to create any sort of taboo. We should open the door for any sort of discussions. We shouldn't also predefine any conclusions of the conference. Probably we need more Europe in many aspects. The lesson of COVID could create some very relevant conclusions and recommendations, but maybe in some other aspects we need less Europe. So we should be also open in this sense. That's all. I don't hear.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Minister Klus, your take on the Conference of the Future of Europe, and we know that you're in charge in the government of working on it.
Yeah, I can easily say that we are ready, and now we are discussing details how this conference should look like also at the national level. We had an experience with so-called national convention before, and we believe that some of the activities we had were very fruitful, and we would be very happy to involve also partners from third sector and academic environment, and we are ready to get out from the bubble we are living in. Exactly as Konrad said, we don't want to speak to European professionals or professionalists. We want to speak to the regular citizens, what kind of Europe they expect. And that will not be an easy job. And we understand that for some people, it's quite a complicated topic, as long as they have no idea how the European institutions works and what they should bring to us. But the main idea of this Future of Europe conference is that we are European Union. So that's why we believe that all of our countries needs to bring something on the table and discuss what kind of future of Europe we expect, and more or less share that this will be very important topic of the German presidency, and we are ready to be very active part of that. This question is heavily interconnected with if we are ready to open the treaties of European Union, and we are quite pragmatic in this case, and we know that it is not that problematic to open the treaties, but it's problematic to find a compromise and to close them. And we understand that, for instance, for some governments like the one in Austria, this is a very important topic. We are ready to discuss it, but to be very honest, again, to you, I'm not that much sure if we are able to find a compromise, and we are ready to really open the treaties, because there are some countries which are openly against such a possibility, and we of course respect that it could be very, very complicated, especially after the experience we had from 2009. If it comes to the Lisbon Treaty, I guess our Czech friends know what I'm talking about, and especially European Constitution, let's call it like this, and the experience we have from France and the Netherlands. So this is what we don't want to experience again, and I hope we are all now in the process of the lessons learned from this historical experience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Minister Chmielarz, Czech Republic has been famous for a little flavor of Euroscepticism in the country. Do you think that the Conference on the Future of Europe will increase the love towards the European Union in the country? And do you consider having cross-border consultations, for example, between Czechs and Slovaks or Czechs and Poles, maybe with the hope that the neighbors can infect the Czechs with a little bit more enthusiasm for the European Union?
Well, thank you for this question. I think that skepticism per se is actually a good quality because it requires you to look on what you are offered, for example, with your due diligence and really to analyze it before you accept it. And I think that skepticism should not be taken as a negative in this debate overall, especially when we talk about the EU future and if we would be talking about the treaty change, because this is a very serious issue that can be actually counterproductive also in the long term. And my colleagues have already pointed that out, that if we are facing hurdles in terms of the treaty change ratification, this could actually end up dividing Europe much more than what those advocating now for treaty change as part of the process would want. But taking aside such serious issues such as treaty change, which could really and should come only at the end of the debate if we see that we do not have any other choice to improve the workings of the EU. I think what has to be very clearly said is also for this debate, as Konrad has said, not to become a debate for Europeanists, to try to concentrate on topics with added value to the citizens. And despite that, we had and we've heard from different member states and from different areas the ideas for institutional change. We've heard debates that are needed on Spitzenkandidat or on reform of the electoral law to the European Parliament. These are not questions which concern our citizens, I dare to say. And they are really an internal discussion on what the EU should do, maybe in terms of how it could do, but it's a very much Brussels-based or Brusselist discussion in this respect. And I don't mean it negatively, but it's for specialists. What our citizens, I think, need to know is that we have to clarify the question on what role should the EU play in the world and what should be our common ambition. And Konrad very much has pointed out that maybe in some aspects we do not need the EU to be present. It is not a Eurosceptical position, in my view. It is just a very pragmatical one based on the effect that we really need the decisions to be taken as close to citizens to increase maybe also the credibility and legitimacy of the EU. And yet we have to decide on areas such as the global role, what the EU wants to do, whether we want to be a big player, whether we want to really have the strategic autonomy, and what is, for example, a strategic autonomy. We do not have a consensus yet. I don't think that we have a common understanding, for example, of the concept. And this is key, especially in the COVID crisis. It is key when the multilateral system actually is going through a certain transformation. We need to know what the EU is for and what ambition it should take. I think that's the most important aspect that we have to define. And maybe on the way, we will solve some more particular issues, such as the double quality of foodstuff for Central Europe or plastics, as some other member states actually would also want, for example. But these are the small added values that could also be part of the discussion, not just treaty changes and big questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. And we'll follow up for the last round of questions with a few questions bundled together so that you can pick which ones you would like to react to. And Milan Nich is waiting in line to ask the question live. And while he's being brought in, I'll read out two more questions that go more into the European global role and strategic autonomy issues. One of them connects to the future of the European defense integration. And another one is asking the ministers to reflect upon the consequences of the potential digital tax on the relations with the United States. And Milan has a third question.
Thank you, Aliana. Thank you very much to GLOBSEC and to CEPA for organizing this webinar. So now I'm based at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, and therefore one question to all and then one special for Minister Szymański. Question to all of you is for other important topic of German EU Council presidency, which is relations with China. There will not be a summit at the at the leaders level in September, but what do you expect from the next half a year and from German presidency to achieve in relations vis-a-vis China? And now, question to Minister Szymański, mindful of our transatlantic audience in this webinar, I have to ask about President Duda, your president's visit in the White House yesterday. The impression I got, I followed the press conference, was that there were no clear results, that this was a pre-election visit for President Duda, who is facing on Sunday elections in Poland, and he was played by President Trump for his elections. There was some tough messaging on moving NATO or moving US troops from Germany to Poland. How do you deal with your colleagues? I know this is not your portfolio, but relations in Europe is your portfolio. How do you address these concerns that your president was part of the pre-election game in the White House?
Thank you very much, Milan. We have a specific question to Minister Szymański, so I would go with you first. And besides the question, we have the expectations towards the German presidency and what's feasible to achieve vis-a-vis China, European defense, and digital taxation and implications on the EU-US relations. Please, you do not have to answer all 4 of them, but feel free to pick up on the ones that you like the most. Minister Szymański.
I think all of those questions, including the specific question addressed by Milan to me, are related to the big question of the EU-US relations. And it is obvious that Poland is one of those countries which are concerned with the fact that the transatlantic ties, because of many reasons, it's another seminar, but the transatlantic ties are not granted for the moment. And you can easily imagine a situation when the transatlantic ties are weaker and weaker, which would be at the expense of our security. I mean, our own common security, not only Central European or Polish European security. We believe that we should invest and we should do our best to consolidate the unity of the West. Whatever political changes are happening in this capital or another capital, we have to find a common ground, maybe a new common ground for closest possible economic, political, and defense relations, because the West is something wider than the EU. And this is why we believe that we should be careful with our reactions to the political development in our own capitals, I mean European capitals, but also in capitals of the rest of the NATO countries or the rest of the West. This is why we are rather concerned by the development in some other capitals than concerned by the development in Washington or Warsaw, because we try to execute, we try to implement our agenda, which is well known for many, many years. We want to invest to the relations between EU, Europe, and US. And here we are with some very specific questions, not very easy to solve, but we have to concentrate on them, like the structural cooperation in defense on European side. We definitely support the strengthening of the defense cooperation in Europe, but we would like to be very clear that we don't want to create this specific capacities. I hope much stronger capacities of Europe to take even bigger chunk of our responsibility for our own defense, not as an alternative to NATO, alternative to US, to transatlantic community, but as a contribution to this. This is, I think, a big issue, because the great and very noble, nicely defined concept of strategic autonomy in Europe means many, many things. And I don't see any canonical definition of this nice words, because I'm definitely in favor of sovereignty or autonomy. I'm definitely in favor of common recognition of strategic interest of Europe, but I would be very careful with the proper understanding of this concept. We will defend the unity of the West, whatever will happen. Whatever differences or divergences will occur. And of course, sometimes the divergences in our community occur. This is not the first time. For example, in trade, we have some problems to be solved or recalibrate. It is, again, another issue, quite complex, but we have to be in goodwill we have to invest and we have to find a way how to calibrate best our common interest, common position, because in the world, we are alone and we have competitors and sometimes enemies somewhere else.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and we'll pass now to Minister Chmielarz. We're running out of time, so please do not feel pressure to answer all the questions.
Okay, so I will stop actually on maybe on German presidency and more specifically on China. What is clear is that the COVID situation itself has complicated not just the Leipzig summit, of course, but also the traditional EU-China summit. And the negotiations could not take place really properly. And despite the fact that we have still many problematic topics on the table in terms of the EU relation to China, unresolved issues, despite that fact, the situation was not ripe. So we will see actually how the German presidency will take it. What is still very clear is that we need this debate and we need a common position on China to avoid basically the divide and rule strategy that could be detrimental to the strategic interest of the EU. So we need a common voice when we talk to China, and I hope that the German presidency will provide for this. And just one last sentence on what Konrad said, I could sign basically every single word. We need to be really realist in terms of the transatlantic relationship. We do not have any alternative to the US engagement on the European continent. And this is important to say, and I think that any alternatives are naive at this stage. So we have to be serious, and I'm glad that the Polish president and Poland itself is actually creating this bind and trying to keep this transatlantic relationship alive, even in a political campaign or before or afterwards, whatever. This is still important for Europe and for Central Europe.
Thank you very much. And Minister Klus.
Thank you. Well, tough to say anything else than Aleš and Konrad already mentioned, but if it comes to US-EU relationship, of course, it's a very interesting combination now with COVID-19 situation and pre-election time in US. But I fully understand what Aleš and Konrad spoke about when they mentioned that we need to fight for a unity of West and that there is no other alternative or functional alternative than this unity. And NATO is the most important defending alliance in the world, and that's why we are all aware that we need very close cooperation with the United States, and there is no other chance for us now. If it comes to China, very briefly said that we can't pretend nothing is happening there. For instance, in Hong Kong lately, but on the other hand, we need to understand that functional multilateralism is very important for us, and from this point of view, it's sometimes quite comic to follow that it's a Chinese president who is fighting hard for free trade in the world, and there is another president who is very unilateralistic. So let's be frank in this case, and let's speak about how to bring back functional multilateralism in our relationship with both China and United States, and we need to be more active in this case. And this is heavily interconnected also with the topic of how the future European Union have to look like.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ministers, for the very insightful discussion and for your time with us. I'm going to pass the floor back to Alina to wrap up this discussion.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alona. Thank you to GLOBSEC for hosting this incredibly insightful conversation together with CEPA. Minister Szymański, Secretary Chmielarz, Secretary Klus, thank you so much for taking the time. Just to echo the discussion we're having at the end regarding the importance of U.S. continued engagement with Central Eastern Europe, the importance of the transatlantic relationship. I couldn't agree with you more. There is no substitute for the transatlantic bind that we've built over many decades. I'm delighted to see that the diplomatic relationship, especially with the recent visit of President Duda, continues, that I am confident that going forward, there will be continued engagement with our Central Eastern European friends and colleagues and allied partners, as well as with the rest of Europe and NATO allies as well. We are all in this together, as all of you have said, and at the end of the day, we'll only come out of this stronger as a community if we're able to do more together, have the kinds of conversations that we had here today, exchange ideas, engage in a dialogue around our common shared values and purpose. As all of you have mentioned, the challenge of China is going to be a long-term generational challenge to all of us. The authoritarian model that China is pushing forth, the kinds of economic and security incursions that we've seen Beijing take over the last years has been significant. And we all need to do our part to ensure that our citizens are aware of the kinds of threat and challenges that China poses, while at the same time, the reality of having to continue to work with China, certainly on the economic dimension, the political dimension. I'm sure there are many other questions that we didn't get to answer from those of you tuning in. But just a quick word from me before we sign off. Once again, thank you to GLOBSEC. Thank you to all of you. And tomorrow, if those of you who are joining this discussion at 10 a.m., we're also hosting a conversation at CEPA with Vice President of the European Commission, Vera Jourova, to talk about our common agenda for countering disinformation. So very much in line with the conversation we're having today. Thank you so much. And I look forward to continuing the discussion in the future with all of you on this important issue as we navigate the COVID-19 crisis and its fallouts. So with that, Elena, thanks again. Thank you, GLOBSEC, and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone.